This is the brother the war gave me.
The lecture hall at Georgetown University was packed beyond capacity on this cold December evening, just 3 days before Christmas break. Students sat in every available seat, lined the walls, and even crowded in the doorways, their phones silenced, their usual chatter replaced by an expectant hush. Word had spread quickly across campus about tonight's special guest, a 98-year-old World War II veteran who had agreed to share his story as part of the History Department's Oral History project. Professor Margaret Chen had introduced him simply as Mr. Frank Kowalski, 101st Airborne Division, Battle of the Bulge survivor. But the students could see there was something more to this frail man who sat in the wheelchair at the front of the room. His hands, gnarled with age and marked by old scars, trembled slightly as he adjusted the microphone. His eyes, though clouded with cataracts, still held a sharpness that seemed to pierce through the decades, but it was what he held in his lap that captured everyone's attention. A faded black and white photograph, creased and worn from decades of handling. Even from the back rows, students could make out 2 figures in the image, one in an American uniform, the other in what appeared to be German military dress, both men smiling broadly with their arms around each other's shoulders. Frank Kowalski cleared his throat, the sound echoing through the silent auditorium. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of nearly 8 decades, but it was strong, clear, and filled with an emotion that made every person in that room lean forward. "This," he said, holding up the photograph so everyone could see, "is me and the Nazi soldier who tried to kill me. He's also the man who saved my life, and 30 years later he walked my daughter down the aisle at her wedding." The silence in the room was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop as 300 students tried to process what they had just heard. Frank smiled slightly at their shocked expressions, the same smile that had charmed nurses in field hospitals, comforted grieving mothers, and eventually won the heart of the woman who became his wife. "I know what you're thinking," he continued, his voice gaining strength as he settled into his story. "How does an American GI become best friends with a Nazi? How does someone who wore the uniform of Hitler's army end up walking an American girl down the aisle? Well, children, that's a story about the strangest Christmas I ever lived through, and the lesson it took me 78 years to fully understand." Frank paused, his fingers tracing the edges of the photograph with the tenderness of someone handling a sacred relic. The students waited, captivated, as this old man prepared to take them back to one of the darkest chapters in human history. It was December 1944, and I was 20 years old, scared out of my mind and trapped in what would later be called the Battle of the Bulge. But before I tell you about Klaus, that's the German soldier in this picture, I need you to understand what kind of man I was back then and what kind of war we were fighting. Frank's eyes grew distant, and when he spoke again, it was as if he was seeing not the faces of college students, but the snow-covered forests of Belgium, the burning villages, and the faces of young men who never made it home. I was born in Chicago in 1924, the son of Polish immigrants who came to America with nothing but hope and a willingness to work harder than anyone else. My father, God rest his soul, worked in the steel mills, and my mother took in laundry to make ends meet. We weren't rich, but we were proud, and when Pearl Harbor happened, I knew I had to serve. Not because I was particularly brave or patriotic, mind you, but because it was what you did. Your country called, you answered. He shifted in his wheelchair, wincing slightly as old bones protested the movement. A student in the front row started to get up, perhaps to help, but Frank waved him back down with a gentle smile. "I enlisted in the army in 1943, right after my 19th birthday. Basic training at Fort Benning was hell, but it was nothing compared to what was waiting for us in Europe. By the time I shipped out in September 1944, I thought I knew what war was. I thought I understood what we were fighting for and against. I thought the world was divided into good guys and bad guys, and all you had to do was figure out which uniform they were wearing." Frank's voice took on a harder edge, and several students noticed his hands had stopped trembling. When he spoke about the war, about those days that had shaped him more than any other experience in his long life, he seemed to shed decades, becoming once again the young soldier who had faced unimaginable horrors with nothing but courage and the hope of seeing home again. The Battle of the Bulge began on December 16, 1944. Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allied forces and maybe, just maybe, change the course of the war. For those of you who slept through history class, let me paint you a picture of what that meant for a 20-year-old kid from Chicago who just wanted to do his duty and get home to his girl. Frank reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook, its pages yellow with age. He opened it carefully, as if the words inside might crumble at his touch. I kept a diary during the war. Not supposed to, of course, security reasons. But I needed somewhere to put all the thoughts and fears that were eating me alive. Listen to what I wrote on December 17, 1944, the second day of the battle. He cleared his throat and began to read in a voice that had grown soft with memory. The Germans hit us like a freight train yesterday. We're falling back, but nobody wants to call it a retreat. The snow is coming down so hard you can't see 10 feet in front of you, and the cold. Jesus, the cold goes right through you like you're not even wearing clothes. Lost contact with headquarters 6 hours ago. Don't know where we are, don't know where the enemy is, don't know if we're going to see tomorrow. Tommy Kowalski, no relation, just another Polish kid from the south side, got hit by shrapnel this morning. Died calling for his mother. He was 18 years old. 18. What the hell are we doing here? Frank closed the notebook and looked up at his audience. Many of the students had tears in their eyes, and he could see that his words were having the effect he'd hoped for. They were beginning to understand that war wasn't the sanitized, heroic narrative they'd seen in movies, but something far more complex and terrible. That was my state of mind when I met Klaus Richter. I was cold, scared, angry, and convinced that every German soldier was a monster who deserved to die. I'd seen what the SS had done to prisoners. I'd heard the stories about the concentration camps. In my mind, anyone wearing a German uniform was evil incarnate, and killing them wasn't just my duty, it was a moral imperative. Frank paused to take a sip of water from a glass that sat on the small table beside his wheelchair. His hands were steady now, and his voice had taken on the cadence of a natural storyteller, drawing his audience deeper into a world they could barely imagine. December 19th was the day my entire understanding of the world changed forever. My unit, what was left of it, had been cut off from the main force for 3 days. We were lost, low on ammunition, and running out of food. The snow was still coming down, and the temperature had dropped to maybe 10 below zero. We'd been moving through this forest outside a little Belgian town called Malmedy, trying to find our way back to friendly lines, when we walked straight into a German patrol. Frank's voice grew quieter, more intense, and the students found themselves leaning forward to catch every word. The firefight lasted maybe 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. When the shooting stopped, 3 of my buddies were dead. 2 more were wounded, and I was trapped under a fallen tree with a piece of shrapnel in my leg and blood running down my face from where a branch had caught me. The Germans had taken casualties too, but they'd won the engagement. I was alone, hurt, and waiting to die. He looked around the room, making eye contact with as many students as he could, wanting them to understand the gravity of what he was about to tell them. That's when I heard footsteps in the snow, getting closer. I had my rifle, but my hands were shaking so bad from the cold and the fear that I could barely hold it. I knew that whoever was coming was going to find me, and I figured my war was over. Maybe my life too. The SS weren't known for taking prisoners, especially not American prisoners. Frank's voice dropped to almost a whisper, and the entire auditorium strained to hear him. The footsteps stopped right next to where I was trapped. I looked up, and there he was. A German soldier, maybe 19 or 20 years old, pointing his rifle right at my head. He was tall, blonde, blue-eyed. Everything the Nazi propaganda machine said was the master race. For a moment, we just stared at each other. I was waiting for him to pull the trigger, and I think he was trying to decide whether or not to do it. Frank reached for the photograph again, holding it up so the students could see the faces of the 2 young men, frozen in time and smiling at something the camera couldn't capture. But instead of shooting me, he did something I never expected. He lowered his rifle, knelt down in the snow, and in broken English he said, "You are hurt. I help you." Just like that. No explanation, no hesitation. He just decided to help me instead of killing me. A murmur ran through the audience. This wasn't the story they'd expected to hear, and Frank could see the confusion and curiosity on their faces. His name was Klaus Richter, and he was 21 years old from a small town outside Munich. He'd been drafted into the Wehrmacht, the regular German army, not the SS, in 1943, and this was his first major battle. Like me, he was scared, cold, and a long way from home. Unlike me, he was also a medical student who'd been forced to put his education on hold to serve in Hitler's army. Frank's voice took on a tone of deep respect and affection as he spoke about Klaus, and the students could see that even after all these years, the memory of their first meeting still moved him. Klaus spent the next 3 days taking care of me. He cleaned my wounds, shared his rations with me, and kept me warm by giving me half his blanket. We couldn't communicate much at first. His English was limited, and I didn't speak a word of German, but somehow we managed to understand each other. He told me about his family, his studies, his girlfriend back home. I told him about Chicago, about my parents, about the girl I was planning to marry when the war was over. Frank paused, his eyes growing distant as he remembered those 3 days that had changed the course of his life. On the second day, Klaus showed me a letter he'd received from his mother. It was written in German, of course, but he translated it for me. She was worried about him, praying for his safety, hoping he'd be home for Christmas. She told him about the bombing raids on Munich, about how his little sister was doing in school, about how his father was working extra shifts at the factory to support the war effort. It could have been a letter from my own mother. The love, the worry, the hope, it was all the same. Frank's voice cracked slightly and he had to pause to compose himself. When he continued, there was a weight to his words that made every person in that room understand they were hearing something profound. That's when I realized that Klaus wasn't a monster. He wasn't evil incarnate or a mindless Nazi fanatic. He was just a young man who'd been caught up in something bigger than himself, fighting for his country just like I was fighting for mine. He had a family who loved him, dreams for the future, fears about whether he'd live to see another Christmas. He was, in every way that mattered, exactly like me. Frank looked around the room, his gaze settling on a young woman in the third row who was wiping tears from her eyes. I know what some of you are thinking. How could I sympathize with a German soldier? How could I see him as anything other than the enemy? These are fair questions, and they're questions I wrestled with for years after the war. But here's what I learned during those 3 days in that frozen forest. The enemy isn't the young man in the different uniform. The enemy is the hatred, the prejudice, the willingness to see other human beings as less than human. Klaus taught me that, even though he never said it in so many words. Frank reached into his other jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn piece of paper. He unfolded it carefully, revealing what appeared to be a hand-drawn map. On the third day, Klaus told me he was going to help me get back to American lines. He'd been scouting the area and had figured out where my unit probably was. He drew me this map, showing me the safest route through the forest, where the German positions were and how to avoid the patrols. He was risking his life to help me, and we both knew it. Frank's voice grew stronger, more urgent, as he reached the climax of his story. But before he let me go, Klaus made me promise him something. He made me swear that if I survived the war, I would find his family and tell them what kind of man he was. Not a Nazi, not a monster, but a good man who'd shown kindness to his enemy when he could have shown cruelty. He was convinced he wasn't going to make it home, and he wanted someone to remember him as he really was. The auditorium was completely silent now. Even the students who had been taking notes had stopped writing, completely absorbed in Frank's story. I made it back to American lines using Klaus's map. It took me 6 hours of crawling through the snow, but I made it. When I told my commanding officer what had happened, he didn't believe me at first. A German soldier helping an American. It was unthinkable, but the map was proof, and the intelligence it contained helped our unit avoid several German positions and probably saved a lot of American lives. Frank folded the map carefully and put it back in his pocket. I never saw Klaus again during the war. I tried to find out what happened to him, but in the chaos of those final months, it was impossible to track down one German soldier among millions. I assumed he'd been killed, like so many others on both sides. I carried his story with me through the rest of the war, through my return home, through my marriage to my sweetheart Mary, through the birth of my children, but I never forgot my promise to him. Frank's voice took on a note of determination, and the students could see that they were approaching the heart of his story. In 1975, 30 years after the war ended, I finally had the opportunity to keep that promise. I was working for an engineering firm that was doing business in Germany, and I had to travel to Munich for a project. I decided to use the trip to try to find Klaus's family, even though I figured they were probably all dead by then. Frank smiled, and for the first time since he'd begun speaking, it was a smile of pure joy. But Klaus wasn't dead. He'd survived the war, had been captured by the Russians in the final days, and had spent 5 years in a Soviet prison camp. When he finally made it home in 1950, he'd finished his medical studies and become a doctor, just like he'd always planned. He'd married his girlfriend, had 3 children, and was living a quiet life in the same small town where he'd grown up. The students gasped audibly. Several of them had tears streaming down their faces, and even Professor Chen, who had heard dozens of war stories over the years, was visibly moved. Finding Klaus was like finding a piece of my soul that I'd lost in that forest 30 years earlier. We spent 3 days together, talking about the war, about our families, about the strange twist of fate that had brought us together, and then apart, and then together again. He told me that he'd never forgotten me either, that he'd often wondered if I'd made it home safely. Frank's voice grew softer, more reflective. Klaus told me something during that reunion that I'll never forget. He said that those 3 days we'd spent together in the forest had changed him just as much as they'd changed me. Before that, he'd seen Americans as the enemy, as invaders who were trying to destroy his country. But taking care of me, talking with me, seeing that I was just a scared young man far from home, it had made him realize that we were all victims of the same terrible war. Frank paused to take another sip of water, and the students waited patiently for him to continue. Klaus and I became friends. Real friends, the kind of friends you can call at 3 in the morning when you can't sleep because the nightmares are too vivid. We wrote letters constantly, visited each other whenever we could afford the trip, and slowly over the years our families became intertwined. My children called him Uncle Klaus, and his children called me Uncle Frank. Frank's eyes twinkled with mischief as he prepared to deliver the final part of his story. In 1978, Klaus immigrated to the United States. He'd always wanted to see America, and after his wife died of cancer, there wasn't much keeping him in Germany. He settled in Chicago, just 20 minutes from where I lived, and we became neighbors as well as friends. He opened a small medical practice and quickly became one of the most beloved doctors in the community. Frank held up the photograph again, and now the students could see it with new eyes. Not just 2 former enemies, but 2 old friends, celebrating a lifetime of shared experiences. My daughter Sarah was born in 1955, 10 years after the war ended. She grew up knowing Klaus as a member of our family, never thinking it was strange that her uncle spoke with a German accent or that he'd once worn the uniform of the enemy. To her, he was just Uncle Klaus, the man who taught her to play chess, who helped her with her science homework, and who never missed a single one of her school plays or soccer games. Frank's voice grew thick with emotion as he approached the end of his story. When Sarah got engaged in 1980, she asked me to walk her down the aisle. It should have been the proudest moment of my life, and it was, but it was also bittersweet. You see, I'd been diagnosed with a heart condition earlier that year, and my doctor wasn't sure I'd be strong enough to make it through the ceremony. I was terrified that I might collapse and ruin my daughter's wedding day. Frank wiped his eyes with a handkerchief, not bothering to hide his tears from the students who were hanging on his every word. 3 weeks before the wedding, I had a mild heart attack. Nothing life-threatening, but enough to put me in the hospital and make it clear that I wouldn't be able to walk Sarah down the aisle. I was devastated. This was supposed to be one of the most important moments in both our lives, and I was going to miss it because of my stupid heart. Frank's voice grew stronger as he reached the climax of his story. That's when Klaus stepped in. He came to see me in the hospital and said, "Frank, you saved my life in that forest 35 years ago. Now let me save yours. Let me walk Sarah down the aisle for you. Let me be your legs when yours can't carry you." And that's exactly what he did. The auditorium erupted in spontaneous applause, but Frank held up his hand for silence. He wasn't finished yet. But here's the most beautiful part of the story. When Klaus walked Sarah down the aisle, he wasn't just representing me. He was representing every German soldier who'd ever shown mercy, every enemy who'd chosen compassion over cruelty, every human being who'd refused to let hatred define them. And when he placed Sarah's hand in her husband's hand, he was proving that love really can conquer hate, that friendship really can transcend the artificial boundaries we create between ourselves and others. Frank looked around the room, his eyes bright with unshed tears and the wisdom of nearly a century of life. Klaus died in 1995 at the age of 71. I spoke at his funeral, and I told everyone there the same thing I'm telling you tonight. Klaus Richter was one of the best men I ever knew. He was kind, generous, brave, and compassionate. He was also a German soldier who'd fought against my country in the most terrible war in human history. These two facts aren't contradictory. They're both true, and they're both important. Frank folded his hands in his lap and looked directly at the camera that was recording his testimony for the university's archives. I'm 98 years old, and I don't have much time left. But before I go, I want to make sure Klaus's story is told, because it's not just his story. It's a story about all of us. It's about the choice we make every day between hatred and understanding, between fear and compassion, between seeing others as enemies or as fellow human beings who are struggling with the same hopes and fears that we all carry. Frank's voice grew stronger, more urgent as he delivered his final message to the students. You live in a world that seems more divided than ever. You're told every day that you should fear people who look different, speak different languages, worship different gods, or hold different political beliefs. You're encouraged to see the world in terms of us versus them, good versus evil, friend versus enemy. But I'm here to tell you that this is a lie, a dangerous, destructive lie that leads to nothing but suffering. Frank held up the photograph one last time, and his voice rang with the authority of someone who had lived through humanity's darkest hour and emerged with his faith in human goodness intact. Klaus Richter taught me that there is no them, there is only us. We are all human beings, struggling to make sense of a complicated world, trying to protect the people we love, hoping to leave the world a little better than we found it. The uniform doesn't matter. The flag doesn't matter. The language doesn't matter. What matters is the choice we make when we encounter someone who is different from us. Do we see an enemy, or do we see a fellow human being? Frank's voice dropped to a whisper, but in the absolute silence of the auditorium, every word carried clearly to the back row. Klaus chose to see a fellow human being when he found me trapped under that tree. He chose compassion over cruelty, mercy over vengeance, love over hate. And that choice, that simple, beautiful, courageous choice, changed both our lives forever. It gave me a brother I never expected to have, and it gave my daughter a father figure who loved her as much as any biological parent could. Frank looked around the room one last time, his eyes settling on the faces of the young people who would inherit the world he was leaving behind. So here's my challenge to all of you. Be like Klaus. When you encounter someone who is different from you, someone who might be easy to dismiss or fear or hate, choose to see them as a human being first. Choose compassion over cruelty. Choose understanding over ignorance. Choose love over hate. Because that choice, that simple, everyday choice, is what will determine whether your generation creates a world of peace or a world of war. Frank sat back in his wheelchair, emotionally drained but satisfied that he had told Klaus's story the way it deserved to be told. The auditorium remained silent for a long moment as 300 students processed what they had just heard. Then slowly, one student began to clap, then another, then another. Within seconds, the entire auditorium was on its feet, giving Frank Kowalski the longest, most heartfelt standing ovation in the history of Georgetown University's Oral History Project. But Frank wasn't looking at the students anymore. He was looking at the photograph in his lap, at the image of two young men who had found brotherhood in the most unlikely of circumstances. He was thinking about Klaus, about the promise he had made and kept, about the friendship that had defined the second half of his life. And he was smiling, because he knew that Klaus's story would live on in the hearts and minds of these young people, and that maybe, just maybe, it would inspire them to make the same choice Klaus had made in that frozen forest so many years ago. The choice to see the humanity in everyone they met, even their enemies. As the applause finally died down and the students began to file out of the auditorium, many of them stopped to shake Frank's hand or to thank him for sharing his story. One young woman, tears still streaming down her face, knelt beside his wheelchair and said, "Mr. Kowalski, thank you for showing us that love really can conquer hate." Frank smiled and patted her hand gently. "Don't thank me, dear," he said. "Thank Klaus. He's the one who taught me that lesson. I'm just passing it along." Later that evening, as Frank sat in his room at the assisted living facility where he now lived, he carefully placed the photograph back in its special box, alongside Klaus's letters, the map Klaus had drawn for him, and a small wooden cross that Klaus had carved during his years in the Soviet prison camp. These were his most precious possessions, the tangible reminders of a friendship that had transcended every boundary that human beings could create. Frank thought about the students he had spoken to that evening, about their young faces and their eager minds. He thought about the world they would inherit, with all its challenges and divisions and opportunities for both great good and great evil. And he prayed that somewhere among those 300 students was another Klaus Richter, another person who would choose compassion over cruelty when the moment came to make that choice. Because that's all it took, really. One person choosing to see the humanity in another person. One act of kindness in a world full of cruelty. One moment of compassion in the midst of hatred. Klaus had shown him that such moments were possible even in the darkest of times, and Frank had spent the rest of his life trying to create more of them. As he drifted off to sleep that night, Frank's last conscious thought was of Klaus, young and scared and far from home, making the choice to help an enemy instead of killing him. It was a choice that had rippled through the decades, touching countless lives, creating bonds of friendship and love that had lasted long after the war that brought them together had ended. And in that choice, Frank knew, lay the hope for all humanity. Because if two young soldiers could find brotherhood in a frozen forest in the middle of the world's most terrible war, then anyone could choose love over hate, compassion over cruelty, understanding over ignorance. All it took was the courage to see the person behind the uniform, the human being behind the enemy, the brother behind the stranger. Klaus had shown him that such courage was possible, and Frank had spent his life trying to pass that lesson on to others. Now, as his own life drew to a close, Frank could only hope that the lesson would continue to spread, one person at a time, one choice at a time, until the world Klaus had dreamed of, a world where former enemies could become brothers, finally became a reality. The photograph sat in its box, two young men frozen in time, their arms around each other's shoulders, their faces bright with the joy of friendship that had conquered hatred. And in that image lay the promise of what humanity could become. If only we had the courage to choose love over fear, compassion over cruelty, brotherhood over enmity. Klaus Richter had made that choice in a frozen forest in 1944, and the world was still feeling the ripples of that decision nearly 80 years later. It was a legacy worth preserving, a story worth telling, and a lesson worth learning. Because in the end, Frank knew we are all just human beings, struggling to find our way through a complicated world, hoping to make choices that will leave the world a little better than we found it. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we find someone who shows us that such choices are possible, even in the darkest of times. Klaus had been that someone for Frank, and now, Frank hoped, he had been that someone for the students who had heard Klaus's story that evening. The chain of compassion would continue, one link at a time, one choice at a time, one act of love at a time. And somewhere, Frank believed, Klaus was smiling,